Hello, everyone, and welcome to Office Hours. As always, this is where we gather every day to help anyone and everyone who is interested learn about modern web-based production. It's where you can submit questions about media creation, distribution, in all of its forms 24/7. You can put your questions in there. In fact, if you want to toss a question in, you can use the QR code that's coming up on the screen right now. Shoot it with your phone or iPad or whatever you have that reads QR codes, and that'll take you into the beginning part of the queue. You can put your questions in there, and we'll check them overnight or as fast as we can. And those questions that are the most appropriate will go into the show thing. If you don't want to do that, you can use the Mukana system, which is a little more sophisticated. If you start there and then get to officehours.global, which is our primary website, you can kind of follow the breadcrumbs for getting into the regular system. One great aspect of that is that you'll be able to vote on the questions. And that's how we program the show. The questions that get the most votes are the ones that we get to the quickest and discuss the longest, typically. So that's how everything works. Today, we're just doing a first hour. So remember, the vote is important to manage to get everything in there. That said, let's dive in. Alexander, what do our viewers and listeners have on their minds for today?
First one this morning is from Scott Hancock in Tokyo. If using 6-source 4 LED lights in a covered outdoor stage, have portable battery units advanced enough to consider a substitute for generator truck? It's a 1-hour event plus rehearsals.
Alex Lindsay's going to help you. Alex?
Yeah, source 4 LEDs should not be a problem. They still are going to pull a lot of power. You just have to you have to do the math. So do the draw. And you can either look at the specs that they have of what the maximum draw is, or you can test it. A lot of us use things, I don't know what you would have in Tokyo, but a lot of us have these little things called kilowatts, or we have a variety of measuring tools that you plug those into, you pull them and see what they're drawing to make sure that you're absolutely correct on what you're doing. And then you can, for 4 of them, I think you'll probably be able to find a battery. There's batteries that will power whole buildings. So it's just a matter of figuring out how much you need. If you see that something needs to be 1 hour of battery, I would probably try to find something that you think will power those for 4 hours. So you don't want to make it 1 hour and 10 minutes. So 4 hours is probably what you wanted to look at. But there are a lot of larger batteries that you should be able to see. So it's not going to be a little UPS, but they're I don't know what the exact numbers are for these, but you're probably looking at something it's probably not going to be super inexpensive. And the problem with you may need to buy them because renting batteries is not like renting generators. The problem with renting generators is you just put gas in and it works. The problem with batteries, you don't know how long it's been used. And those batteries start to lose their effectiveness over time. So you really need to buy them if you want to do them. So it depends on how often are you going to do this. If you're only do it once, I assume that you're either don't have somewhere to put the generator, don't want the noise, those types of things. But you may have to invest in a battery. And these larger banks can be anywhere from a couple $1,000s to $2,000 to $6,000 is probably where I would probably think that I'm going to end up paying for a battery that would power those for an hour.
Yeah, and as Alex said, batteries do get worn out over time. And so if I was doing something like a Source 4, those ellipsoidal lights, even with those good lenses, I mean, you're talking about being far back and having to project light onto a stage. That's a pretty heavy draw. You're not going to do this on little V-mount batteries and things like that. You're going to need, as Alex said, something substantially bigger. And that, I think, requires some engineering to make sure that if it's a one-time thing, you can probably get away if you have fresh batteries and things like that. But if this is a touring kind of thing where you're going to do it a lot, I would be very, very strict about tracking everything in the power system because it's going to take a lot of power to run that much light over that distance. Let's go on to the next question.
Scott Mueller in Germantown, New York. A client has a budget of $2,500 for me to get him the best camera setup that can be permanently set at his computer to record courses via Zoom. Recommendations for camera, lights, capture. I'd like the ability to adjust all things via remote on Zoom.
Leo Mendel's going to help us. Leo.
Hi there. So I'm going to start with the end bit, which is the remote. And while a lot of web cameras can be remotely controlled, my feeling and my actual experience has been that if you want the good quality output, you need something that's got a good lens. And I find it really hard to justify that sort of spend on a webcam. I find that the problems keep creeping in. And when you get a good camera set up, like the camera I have a GH3 on here, and that GH3, once it's set, it needs very little changing. The best thing, if you want to be able to change it though, and the ecosystem I see that works quite well, is to go into the Blackmagic ecosystem. You can then remote onto the computer, get through the ATEM talk to the camera. There's lots of different ways of doing it. I've also noticed now a lot of the cameras, if you use Companion on the PC, the Companion can actually control any camera that's got a network connection. You can do a lot of the settings and the changes, and I've seen that. We've been experimenting with that recently, and we were surprised at how much we can actually control using Companion for a camera that's remote.
Alex.
I do agree with Leo that, getting something with a shorter depth of field is going to look like a lot nicer for training. So if you can afford it, I think it might be hard for you to fit all of these pieces into the cost that you're looking at there, especially the challenge with control is really, so I've moved to Sony cameras primarily because of the autofocus, because I can do this and then I can come right back to me. And what happened was Sony lent me a camera. I used it for 2 weeks. I couldn't not use it anymore. So it was the only way to buy it. So I think that's the challenge. The new EV10s, it's what my wife uses for her events. And it doesn't have LUTs, but outside of that, it has a lot of those things, and it just kind of turns on. But the problem you're going to get into is that if you want to do remote control, you may want to have them be able to move up and down and move around. If you do that, then you're looking at probably an Insta360 link. If you match that Insta360 link with, let's say, a Mac Mini and a MV7, we'll just say, because the MV7 Plus has a remote control, so you have a panel that can control the link, a panel that can control the microphone, and then if you get some lights that either you want to be able to control them from the computer, you could do something that has some kind of DMX control, and then that's just ArtNet out, so you have a little box that goes out of that computer that you can then control everything. And so inside of that, you'd be able to turn the lights on, change the color of the lights, change everything around him, control the mic, control the position of the camera. Again, for a little bit more money, I would be tempted to get something that the issue really gets into the camera not being in the right position and him having to then fiddle with it. Fiddling with a camera by yourself, reframing by yourself is not a great experience. And so having some kind of PTZ, one of the things I have the DJI, I have one of the RS2s that I'm going to try soon to put on this camera because I'm not using it for anything else right now. And so I'm going to put it on this camera so that I can have that there for remote control. And so that for pan, tilt, zoom, because just being able to reframe a little bit is pretty powerful, So I think that $2,500, I would probably pull back into for a fully remote system with $2,500, I'd probably pull back to a Insta360 link. If I had $3,500 or $4,000, I'd probably start going towards bigger camera sensor sizes.
Leo, you wanted to come back in?
Only very quickly. I mean, I mentioned it earlier about Companion, and I've found more and more that we're using Companion as the glue that we need to make these things work. Because once the device supports Companion and we've got Companion running somewhere, we can remotely control that, and we can actually adjust things. So from the ATEM, from the sound, from the ability to control the camera, although I would say Alex is absolutely right. The hardest single thing to do is to adjust your frame set on your own, as I had to do earlier. And it's just, I'm there. I can't be at the front and the back of the camera at the same time. And I'd like to try and find a way, but I haven't worked it out yet.
Just be warned, you will get pictures stolen from the web that look like this as you're trying to control your camera.
I think the problem I have
manually.
Also just... Yeah. Alex was talking about the fact that his camera autofocuses, mine doesn't. So when I do things and I push it in, I have to hold a piece of paper roughly where I think my head is with big letters on it so I can actually see when I'm in, and that's the only way I can do it.
Alexander, you had some thoughts?
Yeah, that's all great advice. I think that, the $2,500 budget's really hard to do because if you want full remote control, you're going to be going into a higher budget, because you're looking at something like maybe if it's just color and exposure settings and focus settings that you want to adjust, then you're looking at something like that little micro 4/3 Blackmagic studio camera. But then you got to add the cost of the ATEM and a cost of the lens, and then quickly you've got no money left for any lights of any kind. Now, somewhere in between, maybe what I was thinking is one of those Sony ZV-E10s, because the Mark II just came out. You could, with a kit lens and some lights, what you could add is for a couple $100, you can get these little pan tilt motorized heads that have just a remote control, and you can just stick any mirrorless camera on top of that too. So if you do want that pan tilt control, you can actually just do it yourself with the remote if you want to reframe yourself. That's a bit of a compromise.
Alex?
Yeah, the challenge really is with those is that the person you're banking it for, theoretically, you don't want them to have to fiddle with it. Like that's kind of the sell there. So that's the challenge. Just remember also that when you're thinking about that budget, that we can talk about a microphone, and there's lots of different microphones that could possibly work. But you have to treat the room as well. So look at the room. If they're in a very sparse room that is mostly walls, there's probably stuff you're gonna have to do to the walls to make it sound good. And it is, I think that Mickey points out the sound is probably one of the most important things, because a lot of times when they're doing training, it's going to be voiceovers under graphics or images or other things like that. So the video is I think still very important. And the real challenge is really depth of field. If you're making online videos, you're competing with YouTubers, and the vast majority of YouTubers are using Super 35 or bigger sensors, the ones that are mainline. And so the challenge for you is that whoever's watching this is most likely watching YouTube statistically. And so without that short depth of field, your videos will look less than. That's the reality now, is that if you're building training, you want to move forward, you really have to start with a Super 35 sensor, micro 4/3 minimum, but Super 35 is generally where most of the creators have gone to. And so that's something to think about too.
Yeah, lots of things to think about. Scott, hope that was helpful. Next question.
Jeff Cohen in Miami Beach, Florida asks, any experience with some of Vimeo's newer tools like their editor, teleprompter, etc.?
I use Vimeo a lot, and I haven't really I haven't taken a dive into many of these new things. But Alex, did you have any experience with them?
No, I was going to throw it to you. I was like, have you played with those? I mean, I think that the problem for me is I don't use Vimeo that heavily because the upload speeds are so slow that it just drives me absolutely crazy. And so I'm just like, I don't want to, I have clients that use Vimeo and it is so frustrating. And because that it's not me, it's them. They're being cheap. They're saving money by having a slower ingress. And it's just really frustrating that I can't. And I think the problem is that I'm used to using Frame.io, where I throw files in and they saturate my uplink. If the building isn't protected, they would take over the entire building's internet. And so I'm used to using all the bandwidth to get things up. And
I have a suggestion for you, Alex. Did you know, unless they've changed it in the Adobe era, there is a link between Frame and Vimeo, and it's literally, they use the same server farms. And in the past, I used to do a lot of stuff on Frame.io. When I pushed it to Vimeo, it was near instantaneous.
Well, I'll have to take a look at that because it's
see if you can take the content that you have on Frame.io and literally just link it to Vimeo, and it should show up quickly. I always see Vimeo as a content distribution network primarily. I know they're working really hard to be a peer service for hosting and the rest of that. But to me, the most important aspect of Vimeo is the ability to plumb it into websites super easily. So if you have a library of content on Vimeo and it links to a dozen websites or whatever, changing your source video on Vimeo, which is very easy to do, just replace it. Refreshes your entire network of distribution, which can save you huge amounts of time.
Yeah, and if what's being talked about, I think what Jeff's asking about right here is the This is the kind of edit video the way you would edit a document, and this is available in things like Opus and Descript, both and other things. I mean, this is now becoming more and more available across a lot of the tools. I think the hard part is I think that Vimeo is going to go down this path. Where you want to test this is take something out there and do a bunch of edits with it. I haven't done it, but it's the crossfades in the edits. When you do that, does that really work? And I think that Opus and Descript have finally kind of figured that out. But the little ticks that happen because that waveform didn't get all the way to the ground on some of those is a little frustrating. So you have to make sure that you're not ticking along that process. And so if it's doing that fairly well, then it would be probably, it's one of those things that I think it's becoming kind of table stakes for a lot of organizations. Like, hey, you're going to lose a lot of people. They're not going to use your product if you don't have this edit by text. But it's by no means innovative at this point. It's becoming table stakes. Like everyone within 2 years, like every editor, every service is going to have some version of edit text, and it's revolutionary that we get to do this, because when what's typical for us is and the reason Vimeo is probably important, and the reason it's good for Descript and Opus and everybody else, is what we used to do is I used to do about 10 hours of interviews, 10 or 11 hours of interviews a week. And we would take those, and then I would take all that audio and send it to a company called Production Transcripts in LA, which they're still great, by the way. But they would hand do everything with time code. Then I would send that transcript to the client. The client would then highlight the things that they wanted, and then we would go through by hand with the time code and assemble that for them. And that's what it did. Now you just open it up and just cut and paste, and you get the thing that you're looking for. So this is this went from something that was Simon Says did this, I don't know, 5 years ago or something like that. But now it's become something that almost everybody's doing. So it's really, and then you have things like Opus that just suggest what you should do. Like, here, you should try this, and it's actually pretty good at it. So we're going to see more and more of these things, but I don't think it's necessarily. Jeff said that it's mostly. He said the edit clicks are mostly solved. Getting exact edit points in individual words is not perfect. Well, that's going to be problematic. So anyway, if you're
Frankenbiting things, you need to put a brain behind that.
You just have to look at how much time you're spending doing it. That's all.
Yeah. Let's go on to the next question.
Leo Mindell in Richmond, London asks, when setting up an installation or live production, what is your go-to video or audio track you use to test, and why?
Leo, you're here, so explain yourself.
It was a question I was having and thinking earlier. I don't know why, but when I do a setup, I always then immediately go onto YouTube and type in Rolling Stones. But sometimes that's been very inappropriate for the location I've been in. But it's something that I like to listen to because I think it gives me a good sounding and of what the venue sounds like. But I'm sure I've got to find something better, and I'm just really curious of what other people think I think it's completely personal.
Yeah, here's a very non-scientific sample. We're going to start with Alexander. What do you test your system with?
Yeah, so I always say test with song. If you're going to test with songs that you know incredibly well, like how that snare sound should be, that kind of thing. So for me, when I'm tuning a system, I do definitely use music, but the first thing I do when I'm tuning a system is I always set up my RTA mics in the room and run pink noise and have a reference curve that I try to achieve. So I'm looking at stuff like that. But after that, I like Steve Winwood's 1986 Back in the High Life album, and that the first 3 tracks on those on that album I know so well because I've listened to it on my reference hi-fi system, and I know kind of how that opening song on that album, how that kick and snare should sound like. So I use those 3 tracks, and also recently I discovered Peter Gabriel's new album, the first single they released off that album called The Court. It is so well recorded. I've been using that now, and it's a great song too. But those are the songs I'm using right now.
Alex?
So I build a lot of these tracks. So a lot of these, it depends on what we're doing. A lot of times we're testing transmission so that we can know whether the channels are working. So a lot of things that I do are 5.1. So I have these like channel checkers that say, channel, left, right, center, like those kinds of things, so that I know that all my speakers are where they need to be and what they're doing. If I'm doing transmission tests, I shoot a lot of ocean shots. Anytime I'm around the ocean, you'll see me out there shooting with my iPhone or shooting with the camera. Oftentimes I bring cameras with me if I know I'm going to go to the beach because they're really hard to encode. So I capture a lot of ocean shots at different frame rates because a lot of times I might be testing 23.98 or 59.94 or higher. And so I need to make, I need reference footage that is difficult to encode at different frame rates and different resolutions up to about 8K. So I have those that I kind of want to play through the system. And then for music, once I've kind of, I lean, because I grew up with it for whatever reason. I'm a big fan of Holst the Planets. The reason that I use it as a test, and specifically Jupiter, is because the strings they'll pull out a lot of things that are wrong with your system, especially with encoding. So strings in general are difficult to reproduce well. And so, but it's got a lot of different moves to it. But Holst the Planets in general, but Mars and Jupiter are my favorites to play into a system at full tilt.
For me, it's Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon, particularly Time. I want something that's airy, has a lot of little ticky-tickies, and then when the bottom end comes in, it better be there. Anyway, next question.
Jacob Goodnight in Indianapolis, Indiana asks, Sony announced the ZV-E10 II yesterday. It features the same sensor size as the FX30, LUT support, S-Cinetone, 10-bit 422 recording, etc. for less than $1,000. Thoughts?
Alex, start us off.
So I didn't see, I guess you may have found that, I didn't see it in their documentation that they did support LUTs. With LUTs, I think it's a great camera to use. It's a couple $100 more than the original ZV-E10. That's the E10 is what I said earlier, my wife uses for her events. And it looks great. People comment on it every day. It's a great camera there for the cost. We had a little trouble with the heat for a little while, but now can leave it on. You just have to use the battery insert. It's kind of a common problem for the Sonys, is that you need to use the fake battery as a power source. And they even have like a little latch, a little opening in the power thing for the cord to come out. So they seem to know. So anyway, we do that. The other thing we do is to make sure that continues to work is we keep the window open so we don't shut it against the thing. So there's a little bit of a heat thing that you still, and I don't know, this one may manage it better, but there's still a little bit of a heat thing. I use the FX30. She uses the E10. And the E10 II looked great. And I looked at it and go, well, I just don't know whether it has LUT support, because that was the reason that I kind of came back to the FX30. So anyway, so I think that it looks great. I don't really record on cameras that often. I mean, cheaper cameras, unless they're doing ProRes, it doesn't really mean anything to me because I don't want to deal with any of the other formats. So the record process isn't important to me, but the other parts seem to look pretty good.
Leo Mendel.
So this camera looks quite interesting to me because I've got a number of lenses that will fit straight onto it from the bodies of the stuff that I've used in the past. However, I always used to run into the problem of the battery life, or the fact that they had stopped the camera allowing the recording or the streaming for over a certain amount of time. So I don't know if this one has that problem fixed, which I'm hoping Alex is going to answer.
I don't think that they have that problem anymore. A lot of the stopping, some of it was a power address issue, but the other thing was it was a European tax standard. So a lot of the stuff that stopped at a certain time, some of it was related to power and heat. Other things were related to it was defined as a video camera if it recorded over a certain amount of time, and then there was increased taxes on it, and so they just had it turn off like at whatever that number was. I think that the European Union finally got rid of that because it was dumb. So anyway, but I think that's what was slowing down the cameras. I think enough people complained, like, they're ruining our cameras because you have this stupid law that wasn't really designed to do that. Like, it wasn't designed. The law wasn't done. I think they got rid of that maybe a decade ago. So,
Alexander.
Haven't dug into the specs yet. So perhaps the FX30 and this new camera, the Mark II, share a similar processor, or maybe it's the exact same processor. I'm not sure. But Alex, can you speak to the APS-C and Super 35? Because my understanding is that Super 35 is a specific standard size. I don't think APS-C is the exact same size as a Super 35, which is what he's saying.
It's not. It's just close. I use it as shorthand. I mean, APS. I mean, it's effectively. I mean, we can talk about a couple pixels and a little bit of millimeters back and forth. And the APS-C, who uses APS-C can vary a little bit, but it's not dramatic, and it's pretty close to a Super 35 sensor. And so it is. I mean, we can niggle about the sizes, but they're pretty close. I mean, if you're is this close, I don't want to. It just gets confusing if you say APS-C and then say also Super 35 because they're almost the same. They're not, and yeah, they're not precisely the same. Sometimes different manufacturers think of APS-C as different, but they're within a couple millimeters.
Next question.
Chester Sweeney from Las Vegas, Nevada, and from the QR code. When doing live audio gigs outside in the high heat of triple digits, are there any big fan, brand, or style differences to keep the crew safe and cool?
We can talk about this for a while. Alex, start us off.
Yeah, well, the first thing is riders. So I have the rider for me to work outside. I'm highly resistant to working outside. I have done it, but I don't I will push back pretty hard and usually charge extra if I have to work outside. I don't really like it because it's so many variables that are added to what I'm doing. So usually I require that my gear and my crew are in a space that is enclosed and less than 75 degrees. And so it's just, and someone's got to supply that, and I can supply it, or the client can supply it, but it's got to be there. And usually that's a tent that we drop down. Usually you can get away with a tent that just kind of pins to the ground, but a lot of times we like to enclose them so that we can actually put an AC unit, and then we bring AC units in to put those into the tents and keep the tent nice and cool. And I mean, I say 75 degrees, but I prefer the tent to be at 65 degrees. But we keep them pretty cold when we go in there, or we find a location somewhere nearby. Remember that with fiber, I can be in a lot of places. So there is, but shade is important. Obviously, water is important. You can get, it depends on how big your crew is. There's whole trucks that provide AC. But a lot of times we get away with individual units that are pumping that in, and that unit can sit outside. It can have pipes that pump that in, so it's not inside of your tent. Remember that you generally with an AC unit comes the need to just deliver water somewhere. so the water's got to come out somewhere on an AC unit. So you got to figure out where that is. So those are some of the things that you want to think about. There are times, I worked in Cambodia where we didn't have any of those things, and we couldn't actually turn on it was 118 degrees, and we couldn't turn the barcodes on until 6 o'clock in the evening because there was no way to, they wouldn't run. So you can have to manage those things without that. But in general, we try to really manage that tightly. It's not good for the equipment. It's also not good for the crew. And the crew, my main complaint about the crew getting into a warm environment is that they don't think as well. And then they tend to people don't think, I don't care what anyone says. Most people, not all people, if you grew up in 85 degree weather, maybe not. But most people that I work with don't operate as effectively over 75 degrees as they did under 75 degrees. And then they start making errors, and then I get blamed for them. And so the reason that I keep the temperature down is because I don't want anyone to make errors. I don't want them to get tired or sluggish because it will affect how I look in the show. So it's a very technical. It's not like it's a bit of a comfort thing, but it's really technically like people make more mistakes. And so I tend to, and again, there are people who do it and everything else, and that's just not a business that I like to be in. so anyway.
Alexander?
Yeah, so I do sound occasionally, and for bands and stuff like that. And so for bigger festivals, definitely outside in the peak of summer, having a tent is a good idea. We don't all have budgets for pumping in AC, so I don't know specifically about brands, but just those big industrial circular fans blowing on you is nice. Also, having a hat is a really good idea. I made the mistake one summer. I did wear a hat, but the hat had a lot of holes in it, and my head got really burnt, and I never did that again.
Alex, you want to come back?
There was a time for a couple of years I had invested in a truck. a trailer, 24-foot production trailer. So great. Like, I just got to say, if you can afford it, it is so great. So all the production's in there. It had 3 air conditioners built on the top of it to feed it in, and so it was an amazing experience because you'd always be out in these horrible hot areas, and we'd walk into our little production area, and it was all nice and cold. So if you can afford a production trailer, Marketech used to make them. I think it's someone else now. I would highly recommend it.
I'll speak to this a little bit, having spent most of my career in Phoenix, Arizona, in the desert, having to work with crews and hire crews and send them out. So a couple of things to think about if you're in high heat circumstances. Number one, even if you have air-conditioned respite somewhere, going from full heat outside into air-conditioned multiple times a day will knock your socks off at some point. You will crash out at the end of the day and sleep like you've been knocked out because it's very hard on the body. We had once upon a time a spa shoot, and we had 10 spas delivered to our property, and we had 2 long days of working in the middle of the Arizona summer. And what we actually had to do was set up, we had the studio inside that was air conditioned. We set up a tent and did swamp cooling, which is basically evaporative cooling there. And then the outside sets, and we had as much shade as we could, consistent with having to have the sun on the models who were in the spas that we were shooting. And we actually discovered that it made sense to make a rule that you really shouldn't go into the air conditioning more than maybe twice a day if you were on the working crew. And I kind of joined the crew and did the same thing, because that body regulation back and forth from cool, dry air to outdoor heat was just really wearing on everybody. You also have to pay a lot of attention. If you're outside in the heat, things get really hot. So things like gloves you don't think about. But if you have to go out and change grip gear in a summer circumstance, it can be extremely hot, and you can burn yourself really easy with that. Lots of water available. Not super cold water. We found that if you're trying to keeping hydrated, more kind of cool water, something kept in the shade but not really hot, is more palatable over the course of time. And just check in with your crew constantly and make sure everybody's doing okay, because the amount of heat that you can sweat, the amount of hydration you can sweat out in those kind of conditions, especially if there's any humidity. I mean, I was lucky to be able to do that in Arizona, where it's a kind of a dry heat. I did a shoot once in Houston, and it was one of the most difficult things I ever went through, even after growing up in Phoenix and being really good in terms of my personal perspiration cooling system. I mean, I grew up in that, so I'm used to it. That Houston shoot just about knocked my socks off because it was so humid and I just couldn't cool down. And so take this stuff seriously. I'm glad you're thinking about it. Big fans, the only problem with them is if you've got any kind of grip gear rigged, you can get so much wind going through that you're turning them into sails and things like that. So make sure your grip for reflectors and things like that is really solid if you're using the bigger fans. And I'm more inclined to think of personal cooling fans and things like that. We set up little ones on stands around so that somebody who was taking a piece of equipment between point A and point B could stop and just stand for a minute and cool down with that fan on their face. The swamp coolers, we had 2 of them outside, and you can get small ones that are pretty inexpensive that will just drip water through sisal and blow air through it. So these are all techniques you can use. But thank you for asking the question, Chester, and make sure that your crews can live through these long, hot days. It's a tough thing. Next question.
Brian Taylor in Washington, D.C. Did YouTube just break Downie?
Alex.
I do believe that they broke it and then Downie fixed it. And you'll usually see Downie fixing this about every time. Every time YouTube makes an update that breaks Downie, Downie fixes it, and it just says improved YouTube. If you look at the release notes, improved YouTube, among other ones. This is a cat and mouse thing. Downie, we usually don't like to talk about Downie in recorded episodes because we don't want anyone to know that it exists because it's the best app ever. So anyway, so I use it. You know, it's kind of like my daughter just was at Berkeley School of Music. She was in a recruiting thing, and so she was there playing with a bunch of folks, and she wanted to have a record, and they're just streaming it, and everything else. And I went into Downie and I find the the page that streams on. I put it into Downie, and it says, "What do you want here?" It says like there's a bunch of things here to select, and I selected the one that I want. I literally delivered to her just a recording of her playing within 2 minutes after she finished streaming it. like it was live, like it was on her phone, and it was because it was, because I was able to just clip it real quickly in Final Cut, upload it, or actually not in Final Cut, I just used compressor and just head and tailed it and put it out. And anyway, but the Downie is a great app, and they usually you may have a couple days of it not working, and then it comes back to working, and it works on almost anything that puts video on a page. Downie will download.
Let's go to the next question.
Paul Wallace in Cedar Creek. Please comment on the new Vizrt PTZ3 Plus and PTZ3 UHD Plus cameras. Vizrt brings the BroadcastAV market sharply into focus with today's launch, bridging the gap between ProAV and Broadcast. Leo
Mindell, start us off.
There's a lot of changes happening. When we were 3 years ago, we seemed to run up and stop, which happened with lots of the chip shortages and various other reasons. And now we're getting products that are coming out that are bridging gaps, as they call it. So the nice thing about this one that I've looked at, it's got a nice lens on there, so that we've got a better lens capability. The interesting thing is, though, it's 3G SDI. So 3G SDI is going to be 1080p, so it's not going out 4K on the SDI. So they're trying to push all of their 4K and all of their production down the Ethernet connection. So it's NDI X3. So it's going to be, are you in that workflow? Are you using that? Because if you pop this camera into an older workflow, you may find that you're not going to get the capabilities that you're expecting to see just by changing the camera.
Alex Lindsay.
Yeah, the couple things here. It's got some presenter tracking. So this is really aimed at, well, it says broadcast. I think it's probably aimed pretty heavily at corporate as far as that goes. So you have presenter tracking here. 3D is the ability to, the 3D is sending the telemetry data back from the camera, so rotation and panning and so on and so forth, so that you can incorporate real-time 3D tools, of course, discrete design, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so smooth movement, which is important. So it looks good. As a corporate, pretty standard corporate, it's about 1/2 inch chip. It's 1/1.8, which is a 1/2 inch chip. so the sensor's a little small. So as a corporate environment of capturing stuff from the back of the room, or as doing some of these other things, I think it works well. At the price point, you just have to decide. I think you're going to get a better image quality out of the Canon 500 series or 700 series. So those are 1-inch chips, and they are, a lot of people, and then they have a lot of that telemetry data as well. If you're willing to spend a little bit more and you're doing things in the studio, I would use these in a corporate environment, looking at a stage, so on and so forth. If I'm going to do stuff in a studio, I tend to very quickly move to the Sony FR7s because they're full frame sensors, and it just extends the size of the feeling of your studio. Full frame sensors just change everything about how it feels. Now, you can't put that Sony more than 20 feet from the subject. So it's a studio. It's a cinema camera, and I'm using 4 of them next week. But for things that are less than 20 feet out, the Sonys are amazing. For more than that, if you're doing more traditional corporate, then these smaller sensors with longer throws become more important. And this looks competitive in that area. But again, I would also look at the Canon, the CN 500s.
Leo, you wanted to come back in on this?
The houses of worship, which is an area that I do a lot of work in, a lot of them, as we said, did all their installations 3 or 4 years ago, and they put in the 1080p cameras that were the rage at the time, the PTZ optics, the bird dogs. Those cameras have now come up to the end of their usable life because you've costed them over a 3-year period, so we're over that period, so now it's time to actually look and see where we're going. And I do think that we're going to be seeing a jump in that area. We're going to be seeing a jump to people wanting to do 4K, not necessarily outputting it to 4K, but the same way as they've been looking at their phones and seeing what they're getting of the quality of the images that they're getting. People are getting tuned in to be able to see that they actually need to improve their image quality. So I think cameras like this will start to becoming more and more the norm as the cycles move forward. So I think it's an interesting area.
Alex, you wanted to come back in?
Yeah, and I will say that I think that the sensor size and the effective short depth of field is probably more important than resolution. So a lot of people want to say 4K, 4K, 4K. But if the sensor size isn't big enough, A, you don't have enough light sensitivity, and B, you don't, so that as you put 4K into smaller sensors, you end up in a situation where it's not as good in low light because just the sensor size, the individual sensor sizes are too small, and so they have more errata, and so that's the real issue there. So you really don't want to see, in my opinion, a 4K sensor under APS or Super 35 or whatever is probably going to have a lot of light issues.
Let's go to our next question.
Zach Stallsmith in Chautauqua, New York asks, here's a fun, strange question. I want to live stream from an arcade and have seen streams that use devices to capture the screen from Miss Pac Man or other older arcade games and split the signal between the console and HDMI. What would achieve this?
Welcome to ClearScan. Alex.
Yeah, there's a lot of things. This is the smallest one that I have, which is this tiny little, this will split HDMI, out. So you can get something like this. And this one actually, this is 2-to-1, but you can get ones that go the other direction. So there is, you can definitely get little splitters. You may decide you want more control over them. So then now, you can get routers, 4x4 routers, 1x4 routers, 4x1 routers. Those are all things that are there that are probably a couple $100. The one that I have is an 8x8, which is like probably a lot more than you need, unless you're playing a bunch of games that you want to put out there. So, but splitting it, if you're using consoles, now you said you're at an arcade. If you have to actually use an arcade game, now you're dealing with the glass. You're dealing with so the things you're going to have to think about are, number one, is the glass is going to pick up reflection, so you're going to have to kind of black it out where the player is. You're not going to be able to have a player just sit and play because it's going to pick up all these reflections. The other thing that's going to happen is you're going to keystone it because that camera's not going to be typically not going to be parallel to the camera sensor is not going to be parallel to the surface of the game. And so as a result, you'll have to know how you're going to keystone something. One thing that you may want to think about when you start to manipulate images is look at things like Touch Designer, which will let you do that in a live environment where you can start moving things around. So that might be another thing to consider.
Leo Mendel.
So I read this question to talk about the fact that you're talking about old games. So old games, HDMI didn't exist. So you're going to have to get an RCA converter. So you're going to have to pull it out as a composite image that would come out with remember the old days of the yellow connector, the red connector, and the white connector. And hopefully the yellow connector will give you a signal. You'll be really lucky if you hit it first time. Invariably, you end up buying about 5 or 6 different converters until you hit and find something that works. The big problem you're also going to have is you're going to be running on something that's either running on NTSC or it's going to be running on some version of PAL. It particularly depends on where the game was made. These units were shipped and left out. It is going to be a bit of trial and error to try and get that picture out. You can do it. It used to be something we did a lot of, and a lot of the retro games, they love running on these big CRT screens. Getting them out, getting that picture out is going to be fun.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was saying when I mentioned ClearScan. Back once upon a time when we had to shoot CRTs rather than taking direct feeds, we ran into the issue of, even at the time, a good camera like a Pro camera would have trouble syncing to the refresh rate of CRTs. And if this refresh rate isn't synced correctly to the camera's shutter speed, you end up with this moving bar or band that can be either really wide or really narrow that's a completely different tonality from the rest, and it moves, and it's incredibly distracting. Even back in the old days, cameras like the Sony broadcast cameras had a function called ClearScan, and you'd be able to dial in precise shutter speeds to the point where you could synchronize and get rid of that rolling band. That plus what Alex was talking about in terms of if you're going to do an OTS shot, an over the shoulder, and you're going to want to see the player playing the game and see the screen of the of the game being played at the same time, there's a lot of angles and a lot of lighting concerns. I 100% agree with him in terms of reflections. This would be a relatively complex field shoot for me. I would bring a lot of duvetine. I would bring a lot of a cage thing. I would try to figure out what the angle of reflection off that glass is going to be. And you want black that covers wherever the reflections are coming from. If you successfully do that, you can get a clear camera shot of the screen and the player at the same time, or just the screen itself, if you take into consideration what Alex was talking about in terms of keystoning and making sure the geometry of the shot is okay for you. It's going to be very hard to get it perfect because it's designed for the head of the player right there, and they're looking at the screen. But Leo, you want to come into a few more suggestions?
Only I was going to say, I would suggest you go and shoot pinball machines. They're much, much easier. There's a great pinball museum just north of Miami. It's great to go and see it.
If you can take the glass off the front of those and just shoot the pinball machine itself.
There is a pinball museum in Alameda, California that I just went to. 200 pinball machines ranging from the pre-pinball, like 1920s. All the way up to the modern ones, and it's so I've found that the 70s is really my 70s into early 80s. Once they got to the 80s, they started doing 2 layers, and I was like, okay, I know, because before you never knew, like, what do I actually like? When you have 200 of them and it says what date it is, you realize there was a certain time when they made the pinball machines that you liked, and now I know which time that is.
And the one I went to is in Delray. The Delray one, it's just unbelievable. And I absolutely agree with Alex. It's the 70s/80s machines, which were just the sweet spot. Play the old ones, the 30s and 40s ones, it was just too boring. And the new ones, they're not pinballs. They're just not. They've just got too much computers.
It's too much going on.
Too much going on.
Wait, I just want to show one thing that there was one in the museum that was there was one in the museum that was actually they made the sides transparent. So the whole thing. So here's a video of it. Let's see if I can cut to it. So that's the inside of the pinball machine. You can kind of see the ball bouncing around in there, and every once in a while you see it. You see all the stuff happening to it, but you can see all the little pieces moving. It's anyway. I'm going to try to get them to
actuator jungle. Awesome.
I'm going to try to get I'm trying to take that video back and have them let me take one of the sides off or plant that camera next to it in stereo so that you can get Apple Vision Pro, stereo stream of the inside of a pinball machine.
Inside the pinball machine. Awesome. Nice question. Thanks, Zach. Zach Stallsmith asked that. Next question.
Chester Sweeney from Las Vegas, Nevada with a QR question. Question about mixers. Are there any brands or types to avoid in live audio production as a newer person to live audio bands?
Alexander, start us off.
So it depends on what you're doing. So if you're trying to do this as a profession, I would go with a digital mixer. Analog still has its place for very small things. I know a lot of us here don't like analog mixers, but for certain really small gigs, an analog mixer might make sense. But if you're going to be doing production, I certainly would not use an analog mixer these days. I would probably go digital, and it depends on what your budget is. So on the more affordable, and when I say more affordable side, I'm talking under $10,000. There's a few brands to look at. Allen Heath, the SQ series, is very good value for money, incredible processing power on those. Also the Yamaha TF series as well. Even the PreSonus Studio Live Series 3 consoles, I've used those quite a bit. Like the 64S, that's a great console, and the digital stage boxes that use AVB networking are really good. So I would look at those for under $10,000 and probably not look at the analog consoles because you're going to want parametric EQ, you're going to want graphic EQ, you really need the processing is what you need. And without having to get a lot of outboard gear, which is just a pain to have to lug around all these cases and racks of gear these days. So I would suggest digital.
Leo Mindell.
Yeah, I mean, yesterday's show had a lot of information about this, and I would suggest rewatching that because a lot of it was covered. But I would say that the big thing to me in everything that I deal with, everywhere we go, we really only see 2 or 3 different brands, one of which is covered extensively yesterday is the Behringer range, the Behringer X32 or the Midas equivalent. We also see a few others. But if you're if you're buying, then that's the way, they're the ways that people want to go, or you're going to go into the Yamahas or other ones. If you're wanting to expect to see things out there when you're traveling, you need to know the 2 or 3, the Allen and Heath, the Midas, stroke Behringer, and the Yamaha. That's literally going to cover most places that I've ever seen.
Next question.
This one's for me. It looks like a 16-gauge extension cord is not beefy enough for a 14,000 BTU air conditioner. Wire felt like it was melting and extremely hot to the touch. Destroyed Furman power strip permanently. Thoughts?
Welcome to Power is Important. Alex, help him out.
It's not the not the gauge, it's the length. So the gauge creates resistance, and the length is how long that also creates resistance. And so when you add those together, I don't know what the exact math is, but because I have one that is on probably a 16 gauge right now, and it's 14,000 BTU, but it's only running about 2 feet. Like it's a very short cable.
It's 25 feet.
25 feet, yeah. So as you start to make that longer, you want to start getting into larger gauges. You can get 10 gauge, 12 gauge, and these are really thick. But I have for running, and I don't know, I haven't run an AC unit that far for a while. But yeah, when you start running more than about 15 feet, I start thinking about gauge. So that's the, if you're using up a lot of, if you're going to push, 15 amps or 20 amps down something, and there is math there somewhere, but I'm not going to get into the math. I just mostly go, hey, I need something really thick, but you should definitely, you have to be very careful about it. If it's heating up, then you have too much resistance in the cable. And you should, again, when you start thinking about running anything more than about 15 feet, and really, for something like an AC unit, I'd say anything more than about 6 to 8 feet, I start thinking about the thickness of my cable. But 16 gauge is not very, it's pretty thin. But you want to be thinking about 10 and 12 gauge, and you can keep going from there. To get as that length goes long, you have to reduce the resistance as the length gets longer, because the length and the gauge are adding resistance together.
Leo?
So I have 2 little questions on this. As the non-American here, when we're running stuff, we're running them at 230 volts. I don't know if you're running at 110 or you're running that at 230 or 220. And also what we do in Europe, sorry, it's 110. Okay. So this is why big things like that run much better on higher voltage. The other thing that we run in Europe is we run everything in rings. So we will run to a socket, and we'll actually run 2 cables. So everything goes in 2 cables. So the electricity has 2 paths. So you're actually doubling the size of the cable without, and maybe that's also a solution that you can do, is run 2 cables next to each other.
Let's go to the next question.
Scott Hancock in Tokyo is asking, when a corporate PC connected to corporate Wi-Fi has an ATEM connected to it by USB, the Wi-Fi gets cut off. Doesn't happen on non-corporate Wi-Fi or corporate Ethernet connection. How to keep ATEM from being seen as a network device invader?
Alex Lindsay, help him out.
If it's tying down that tightly, I would talk to your IT department. Like, there's not going to be a way. You're not going to be able to change the ATEM to do something different. And anything you try to put in between, if they're that sensitive to it, I've never seen that actually happen. Like plugging in a USB, assuming that you're not on the network at all. So make sure that your ATEM is not connected to an Ethernet, and you plug a USB into a computer. I've never seen it turn the Wi-Fi off. Like that is a very tightly wound. I mean, I'm going to guess that you work in financial district. So anyway, but that's a very, very, very tightly controlled system, probably a little over tight. But I would talk to them about what it would take to do that. But I would make sure that your Ethernet is not plugged in at the same time as your USB connection. Otherwise, what most people do when their IT departments are that tight is what most of them do is try to find a way to not be on the network. And it becomes this kind of hodgepodge of things. But everything from cellular to just not being on the network to doing, there's a variety of things that people do to try to avoid that when IT. So IT, it's in their best interest to work with you a little bit to loosen it up so that you're not working around their system. But most people, there's not going to be any way you're going to get the ATEM to do it other than take it off the network or put it onto a non-corp machine.
Leo?
Yeah, we have a very similar issue when we do installations. The local IT company or the venue, etc., always want to do things in one way or another, including they want to put antivirus software running at full whack on a vMix machine. And we have to remove and just politely say, I know it looks like a computer, but just pretend it's not. It's got nothing to do with you. Let's put it on a separate network. Let's keep away from everything else you're touching, because everything you add to my equipment kills my live production. And they're like, but you need a virus checker. It's like, I don't. We're different. We're in a different ecosystem. Please leave us alone, and we won't touch yours, and you don't touch ours.
Next question.
Andy Kogendorfer in Viera, Florida asks, interesting article, BBC UK election ingesting 369 live feeds into a cloud production workflow.
Yeah, newsshooter article. Leo, help us out. You're there.
Yeah, I was there. I was watching this live. I was actually watching the event, and it was brilliant. It was brilliant production, and it was great to see they were able to bring in all these cameras. So just to explain, they're bringing all the cameras in from all the counting locations. Typically, a geographic area will have one counting location that will count the election results for 5 or 6 members of parliament, and they will bring in all of those counting cameras in, and they will also bring in live people from everywhere else. The amount of switching and the amount of live information was amazing. And you could go onto the BBC app and you could actually watch the count in your geographic location. So they split the country up into about 15 different locations where you then could see the 10 counts underneath there. So it was all on there. So it's amazing how much they were able to do.
Alex Lindsay.
Yeah, there's a couple different apps that will do this that different broadcasters have used to make this work. They use TVU. There's LiveU has one as well, and then there are a couple of SRT solutions as well. So those are different ways of backhauling these. They did have they had a low bar of what it had to do. It was kind of need to be set up by somebody. It could be there. And having so many of them, if there was any kind of little hiccups, there wasn't a lot moving. I was reading I don't know if it was that article or another article, but they said, it could work. And if there's so many of them, we can always cut to something that's working. So it didn't have to work. It wasn't as mission critical as some of the other kinds of phones. But yeah, it's a great idea. And we've seen people do it in, drafts and so on and so forth. But I don't think I've ever seen 369 feeds at one time. So it was a great idea.
Leo, you had a follow-up?
Yeah, on that point that Alex mentioned, one of the things that now it's all coming back, they had holding screens. So effectively you were looking at a tile of Zoom tiles, equivalent of, and they were having holding screens on each of them so that there was something animated. So very rarely did you have a blank tile in the position, but you were able to see what was happening. And if that one dropped, it just went to the holding, and then it would reappear, as it was. I think what's very different is the experience that people are expecting now allows that. So they will allow to have their mindset of watching something. They can say, yeah, there's a holding screen. There's a holding bit there, and I'm seeing the live cameras, which in the past maybe you weren't able to. So it meant that they didn't have to actually do as much switching as you would have had to have done in the past, because they were able to composite the video and say, these ones are live, but this one and this one aren't, but they'll reappear and that one's doing something. So they didn't have to keep on shuffling the pictures all the time.
Alex?
And even 5 years ago, we saw iPhones being used for news production, and now it's just become, commonplace. So news production now is a lot of international, especially international news production, where it's a smaller network that's in the United States, in DC, what was 2 or 3 people is now a reporter with a tripod, a little tripod that they can put in their backpack and their iPhone, and they've got some little mic system that they're using to talk back to folks. And sometimes they're doing that live. A lot of times they're doing their records that way. I'm not sure. I mean, again, especially when we saw the jump between the 14 and the 15, if they're using a 15 Pro, I'm not sure that most viewers would be able to tell the difference, between what they're doing. I think it's changed pretty dramatically.
Thank you, everybody, for participating today. We're finishing up with just 1 hour today from other reasons. Our thanks never change, though. And our thanks go out to our producers, those of you who asked questions during the course of the show and really drove this entire conversation. We really appreciate your doing that every day. If you ask questions today and we didn't get to them, they will go back into the queue. They might come back tomorrow, so check out the show tomorrow. We'll be back same time, same place. To our panelists who always show up, thank you, gentlemen, in today's cake for helping out with all these answers, and to all the panelists who show up here every day. To our amazing back-end crew distributed all across the planet, thank you all. You're quietly sitting back there on comms, pushing buttons, running computers, contributing, and the amazing not during the show crew who is back there figuring out topics, questions, putting their information in. Thank you, everyone, for making office hours possible. We'll see you tomorrow.
Now they need to do it in 3D. Spatial streaming. It's the future.
Ooh.
Only with pinball machines.
I'm going to go do that soon, very soon.
I know. Pinball machines, that was the peak of arcade equipment.
I started playing, my daughter and I started playing pinball a couple of years ago, before COVID. And then the pinball place where we went to died during COVID. So we didn't have anywhere to go. And now we have a place. It's a little expensive, but if I had bought something, it would definitely be a pinball machine. I grew up, my dad had a client who couldn't pay him, so he paid him with a Paragon pinball machine, and so I grew up. It's so good.
I want a graphic now that just says tilt, that I stop whatever I'm doing. If it goes tilt, you're locked out.
You hit it too hard.
Like you have violated the rules of the game.
We were there in the one in Delray for I think 4 hours, and then or 3 hours, and that was by the